Welcome to the Daily Dev Talk with me, Adrian Nantchev, where we explore and share experiences, stories, and lessons 7 days a week from across the games industry, helping you make the best game you can. Stay tuned for today's episode. Good morning, Overload Nation. Adrian here, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Dev Talk, where I talk and give you experiences, lessons, and stories 7 days a week from across the world. Today, I am with Matthew Vigoline from SomaSim Studio to talk about their first released game, 1849. Matthew, first tell us about yourself and how you got into the games industry.
Well, I got into the games industry basically starting out as somebody who played way too many simulation games for way too long. And my co-founder and I had always talked about wanting to make our own type of simulation game, our own strategy games. And then probably 4 or 5 years ago, we decided, well, why don't we just do that? He was at the time working at Zynga, and I was the director of communications for a big nonprofit. So we planned and schemed, and finally in 2013 took the leap and decided to start making our own games, and that's when we started the studio. So yeah, that's sort of a brief, rapid history of how we got to make our first game.
You mentioned Zynga briefly. Remind us, was it you that worked at Zynga or your friend that worked there?
No, it was my co-founder.
Oh, right, okay. And you worked in other game studios before?
No, this was actually my first games job. So.
Oh, so you're generally completely new to the games industry, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I had lived vicariously through my co-founder and partner for about a decade of doing it. But yeah, this was my first foray into the games industry as a designer and writer and art director. But I was I'm a graphic designer by training, so the whole visual world is something that I've lived in for my entire career.
So you'd be quite knowledgeable about like the Fibonacci spiral, rules of three, and composition, tonal value.
Yep, all that kind of stuff. It's stuff that is often discussed, but when it comes down to the brass tacks, it's not something that you actually sort of use every day, but you recognize it. I think it's just the way they just describe the way humans think visually, I think, very well.
Interesting way of putting it, and I agree with that. So tell me about the studio. You say it's the first one you've first ever game studio you've ever worked with and ever founded.
Yep.
So what was the structure? How many people work there and such?
The structure is my co-founder and I are the only full-time employees. We do this all the time. We have an artist that is working with us. He's on a contract basis. And then we have another artist that's worked with us on 1849 and as our UI UX designer. Luckily and thankfully, they've been able to continue through with us after the first game shipped into our second title. So yeah, that's pretty much the studio.
So let's talk about 1849. So it's a business simulator set in 1849 on the West Coast, and this is the game is actually set shortly before the gold rush.
Yes.
And it's a business simulator and city builder.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say about it, or what you wanted the player to experience?
Well, in doing research for the game, our first thought was that we wanted this to be set in the California gold rush, and that it would be all about mining and getting gold out and building mining camps. But very quickly in our research, we sort of discovered that the gold rush really is sort of the event that made California what it is. So as we were building the game, it sort of became not just a business simulator, but it sort of became like a California simulator for that part of history, because the gold rush really did catalyze everything that happened in California after the gold rush. So in addition to just the miners up in the hills, there are also a whole bunch of scenarios about, well, they need wood. Where do they get the wood? And they need food, and they need drink, and you need to supply them, and there need to be supply lines. And so we wanted to really try to immerse the player in that sort of experience of not just the sitting in the river panning for gold or using your pickaxe to bang against rock, but to really bring to light the whole sort of experience that made California during the gold rush.
Now that you mention that, that does make sense because the story is you're developing these small individual towns that gets bigger and bigger
Hmm.
and more complicated. So that
Yeah.
makes sense now you mentioned it. I noticed that, and this is one thing I noticed that I realized and learned a while ago that during the gold rush, it wasn't the gold miners that made the money. It wasn't the boom for them. It was the boom for the people who sold and made the pickaxes
Yep.
and the people who had the food manufacturing and stuff like that that supplied all the gold miners to then dig for gold.
Yeah, if you walk through San Francisco today, none of the streets are named after gold miners. They're named after people who ran the hardware stores and made the jeans and stuff like that for the gold miners. So yeah, it seems that it was the not gold miners who were more successful than the gold miners.
Oh wow! Well, I'm in the UK, so can you think of a name at all? I'm just curious now.
Uh,
I like history.
oh yeah, sure. Samuel Brannan. He was a really interesting story if you go and research him. He came to California and he was uh, pretty sure he was the guy who was running down a street in San Francisco right after gold was discovered in Sacramento, saying "There's gold." And Brannan Street is a north-south street south of Market in San Francisco. So
Wow, that's cool. That's cool. That is the American dream in itself.
yeah.
To pursuit of happiness and such. So tell me, Matthew, how did you go about promoting the game?
Um, we sort of did it the old-fashioned way. We worked with a PR consultant who worked with us to do media outreach and um, work with the press, and that was really helpful around launch. But like leading up to launch, it was it's really important to start 5 6 months before your launch. So we started like pretty much the moment we had shareable screenshots. We started doing screenshot Saturdays on both Reddit and on Twitter, and that was really helpful in getting the word out. And we got a lot of people interested in the game that way. We also did early access on Indie Game Stand as we were finishing off the scenarios and polishing them off, and that was really helpful too. Because there's nothing like having players play your game to start spreading the word. So early access and Screenshot Saturday were sort of, I think, the things that really got us going.
And you said 5 to 6 months before the release of the game.
Hmm.
How long did the game take to actually build
For
in that case?
14 months.
Ah, it's not that bad. And you mentioned a PR consultant. How did that go exactly, and what was your experience with it?
Oh, it was really great. I think we just got lucky and found someone who was just really fantastic to work with. So we had a great experience with it.
Hmm. And
It was great.
just going back,
I'm sorry.
just going back no worries, no worries. Going back to a tiny bit again, that 5 to 6 months. Um, I like that idea. And did you find that 5 to 6 was like a trial and error, or was it just a general rule of thumb that you thought of, arbitrary value?
Oh no, my background before I came into games was I was the director of communications for a pretty big nonprofit. So I've done a lot of PR and done a lot of campaigns, and just looking at what we wanted to achieve and the sort of scope of things that we wanted to do, given our early access, like 3 months before we released the game. That was just the calendar that we sort of agreed to and made sense with us. Like we wanted to start talking about the game about 3 months before the early access, so that we didn't come out of the blue. And then that gave us another 2.5, 3 months during the early access to start working on the launch campaign. So that was just sort of the calendaring that we came up with that really made the most sense given our release strategy and plan.
And that was the schedule then, and you wanted to stick to it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
Cool.
we sort of. I don't. There's a question about funding coming up later, so I don't want to leap ahead. But
That's all right. Well, I'm going to ask it anyway. But I'm also curious about the screenshot Saturday.
mhm.
Isn't that more towards developers as opposed to consumers and gamers?
Yeah, it is sort of more toward other developers, but journalists and
Huh?
YouTubers do hang out on it. We got a lot of pings from YouTubers and from journalists because of Screenshot Saturday.
And did you actively invite and pursue YouTubers, or was that just by chance?
Oh, we did, but only after release. Um,
Okay.
'Cause we didn't really. We kind of wanted the YouTube community to have a more polished experience than our sort of broken early
Oh,
access games. So, yeah,
definitely.
once we were released and had a release candidate, then yeah, we started pursuing YouTubers, but not during early access or not leading up to the launch.
Definitely, I can agree with that. You don't want to give them a half-baked pie or cake or apple pie in
Exactly.
some cases.
There's nothing grosser than half-baked cake.
Exactly, exactly. So, yeah, so how did you go about funding the game, Matthew?
Uh,
And what methods worked?
like I said, it was a long-term plan of ours to start our own game studio. So we planned and scrimped and saved, and then sort of looked at our schedule. And as I said, when we were talking about scheduling before, we looked and realized we have about a year and a half in order to get a game out there and start having revenue come in, or else there's not going to be a studio anymore. So that's sort of what drove us, is that we wanted to build our studio sort of from the ground up, sort of start small and grow organically. So we, using our sort of bootstrapped savings, we leapt into development and gave ourselves the amount of time that where we could feed and house and clothe ourselves, um, and pay for art and things like that. And that was sort of the, we didn't take any funding from anywhere else, and that was deliberate.
Hmm. Okay. Was this also when you said deliberate? So there's no strings attached, so you're not answering to anyone as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, part of the reason that we went indie was that we didn't want strings, so we didn't really want to invite anymore.
It's just in the name, independent,
Yep,
isn't it?
yep.
So, what was cut from the game and why?
Multiplayer.
Oh, wow. Okay,
we had,
quite big.
yeah, we had this as we were planning the game out. We had this idea that we wanted to have a multiplayer trading system where people would be able to send shipments of pickaxes around and cloth, and they would be able to trade with one another. And like, you would build your town, and then say, if you were in the Central Valley of California, you were going to focus on growing cotton that would turn into jeans, and then trade that, and then that whole system would work. And then we sort of started thinking about it. We went, wow, that's a that's a ton of work. That's 3 months, 4 months of development work, and God knows how you tune that in the time that we have. And so the more we talked about it, it was sad. The more we talked about it, the more excited we got about the idea, and the more we realized that we just couldn't do it. So it
Oh,
just
wow.
sort of,
Okay.
had to go away at one point, and we had to sort of stop talking about it. So yeah, we had an idea for a sort of lovely multiplayer system that we just had to give up on.
Wow. Otherwise, the game would have been too big and not enough time to finish it all,
Yep,
and it wouldn't have been balanced properly.
yep,
And thus, the gamer might not have liked it, and then that's
yeah.
not good,
It
is
was
it?
just it just introduced too many risks that we couldn't properly account for, and too much time. So too much risk, too much time on our first game. We decided it just wasn't viable.
Totally understandable. So, what was your biggest thing you learned while working on the game?
Oh, um, there are, I think there are a couple, but I think the big one was that a multi-platform release on tablets and on PCs at the exact same time is just not a good idea. Um, that's what we did. We thought it would be a good idea. We thought uh, it would be, you know, cool to show that we built the simulation game that runs on a tablet, it runs on PC. We thought that would just be a neat idea. That, but it turns out the PC players um, caught wind that it was also on tablets, and they said it's a port. It's not a port. We built them at the same time. It was developed for both simultaneously, and so we got some ill feelings from some of our PC players, and the mobile players just didn't care. So that was sort of a learning, was that kind of messaging that needs to happen differently for both platforms. You need to talk to your PC players just as PC players and your mobile players just as mobile players, and that there's not a lot of cross pollination, at least in our particular niche of simulation games. Um, That was a pretty big learning that we didn't learn until after we released the game. Um, and I think,
That
go ahead.
if you don't mind me interrupting quickly, that's unusual. That is, I've not heard this before. With it released at the same time, and there was discontent. Why is that exactly? Did the PC gamers feel left out, or did they feel that they could have got it cheaper elsewhere on the tablet, or
It was pretty much
why is
it was pretty much a combination of they caught wind that it was cheaper on a tablet. And that's just the way that anchoring on a tablet works. You just can't have a $15 game on a tablet. Um, and we think the game should be $15 on a tablet, but nobody will buy your game at that price point on a tablet. And so I think the PC players thought that they were being charged $15 for a $5 game, when really it was the tablet players who were being charged $5 for a $15 game. And I think it was also aesthetics. We deliberately designed a throwback, a game that looked like Caesar 2 or Caesar 3, that, the isometric 2D view of the world. And I think that style of game has been co-opted by Facebook games and by other tablet games. So just visually at first glance, I think a lot of players saw it was too similar to a tablet game or to a phone game. And those who got the throwback play we were making were really into it. They were like, "Oh, this looks like Caesar. This looks like Pharaoh. This is awesome." But I think there's a generation gap that then didn't get that just saw the games from their childhood, which were Facebook games and tablet games, instead of seeing the games from our childhood, which were the sort of grognardy simulation games from the late 90s.
wow? Okay, so what would you recommend instead? Like release a tablet a month after, or just lower the price on Steam?
No, I would say that you think think about your tablet games differently. Think about um, making a unique snowflake for both platforms. The UI UX differences and expectations on tablets and PCs are, I think, different enough that as a developer it benefits you to think about how they are different. You can't use mouse overs on a tablet. Tab PC players want to mouse around quickly. You can't do that on a tablet. Tablet players want to scroll up and down and swipe and do things that are unique to the platform. So I think when you're designing your tablet versions and your PC versions, you want to play to the strengths of each of them as you design them. So if you're thinking of doing just a port, that won't work. I think you have to think about going beyond that and going to think about how your game is going to function and be integrated into each platform's strengths.
Well, yeah, definitely playing to their strengths and the balancing the gyrosphere that's built in.
Yep.
I think those can be used as well.
Yep.
Definitely, that's interesting and unusual. I've not actually really heard that before. Treat them understandable, especially in hindsight, treat them differently, but not release them at the same time.
Yeah.
That's different. I can understand release a month later, perhaps with some different or less gameplay or mechanics,
Yeah.
or some unique things that each one has. But that's interesting. That's worthwhile keeping in mind for future.
Yeah.
And what was the worst thing that happened, and how did you overcome it?
Um. Unfortunately, I don't think we had really that many negative experiences in developing our first game. Worst thing. I think that was that sort of launch snafu was probably the it wasn't really a snafu. That's the wrong term. I think that was sort of among the bad things that happened. Was after launch there was a very vocal small number of players who were very loud about their opinions that this was a quote mobile port end quote, or this looks like a Facebook game, and it was just on our part was just being on top of that and engaging with them and trying to get ahead of it in the community forums and places where they were posting that and talking about that. I mean, eventually, luckily for us, they were allowed for 5 minutes, and then they moved on to the next shiny thing, and we didn't hear from them again after that. So, but I think it was
Oh,
just
wow.
for us just being proactive and not just releasing the game and saying it's done now, but just um, focusing on on our community both before and after the launch.
Focusing on PR.
Yeah, and putting out and making sure that this little fire flared up and just putting it out before it consumes everything.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And yeah, community management as well.
Yes.
Mhm. So, what was the best game dev purchase or investment, whether it was a software license, top quality piece of hardware or equipment, or could simply be a comfortable chair and a good desk?
I think it was the giant monitor that I'm using to talk to you right now. I love it's like a 26-inch monitor. It's the biggest thing that Dell has, and I love that thing. Um, and just I think the Adobe's Creative Suite is a key piece of technology that um, I really that I use all the time. But again, I'm the art director, graphic designer, so I'm going to be biased toward um, fancy graphic software.
Okay. 26, that's quite big. I'm using only two monitors here, but 26, that's quite
Yeah.
big. Do you have the kind of monitor that you can rotate so it goes landscape and portrait?
Yep.
Cool.
My
So,
monitor is so big it actually breaks some games UI. It's fun.
oh wow, that's a good way of debugging
Yeah,
because you never know what the player could use.
exactly.
And what game development related book, lecture, or learning resource can you recommend?
Um, I was thinking about this one before, and I think um, a book that we both held in some high esteem was it's by Greg Kosticki, and it's called Uncertainty in Games, I think. And it's a really good deep dive into sort of one aspect of game development, that sort of design of uncertainty, which for simulation games, you sort of need the player to be uncertain about how things are going to turn out, and otherwise your game's boring. Like if they know that no matter what they do, the city will be fine, um, then it's just not fun. So it was a really good deep dive into sort of the discussion of uncertainty and how that works in games.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting book worth looking out for.
It is.
Like in Evernote or Trello, do you have a useful or productivity enhancing software, app, extension, or website worth sharing?
um, no, I think not really. I mean, I don't think Excel or Google spreadsheets are that revolutionary or mind blowing. Those are sort of the main tools we use for productivity. So we're a little old school in our planning.
That's fine. I use Notepad a lot just to jot down ideas and just Control S and done
Yeah, I mean,
and forget about it.
Sublime Text is a fantastic text editor. I really enjoy almost everything about it.
I've never heard of that. What is it exactly?
Sublime Text is just a really good comprehensive text editor. It handles, XML, JSON, all of the back-end stuff that you need for game development. It does really good autofill stuff. If you're working on localizations, you can code in hotkeys and stuff like that for strange characters. Like the French have that odd little character, that odd space that they put before all their punctuation marks, that non-breaking space, and you can hard code that in and stuff like that. It's just a really flexible, versatile text editor that you can personalize pretty easily. It's a good tool.
Sounds very useful for programmers, especially.
It is.
So, Matthew, what advice can you give to aspiring game developers, small indie studios, and people trying to get to where you are?
I can't really stress the importance of planning enough. Um, we did something called swag planning, which is an old Microsoft term, I think. It's called stupid wild ass guesses planning. And it's just a way of sort of breaking up all of your tasks into chunks that you can guess how long they take. And then you sort of add that up and figure out how much time things are going to take. It's If you're planning a trip, it's important to have a map of where you want to go and know how much gas you have to see if you can actually get there. And if you can't get there, then you need to replan your trip and figure out where you can get. So I think planning is really important to successful indie development. I think a lot of people just say, I'm going to make a game and start making games, and then before they know it, they've gone down a rabbit hole and don't know how to get out of it.
No exit strategy.
Yeah.
Interesting. I've heard of the Moscow system, which is an abbreviation for must, could, should, and would. Like the prioritization of tasks.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's just important. I think it's just really important to plan and prioritize appropriately.
Plan and prioritize appropriately. Beautiful. So, Matthew, what is next for you, and what's the best way to contact you?
We are currently working on our second game. It is called Project High Rise, and it is a skyscraper simulation game. And the best way to contact me is probably on Twitter. We are at SomaSim_games.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's at SomaSim Games and a Project Skyrise, you say?
Project High Rise.
High Rise.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds very interesting as well. Skyscraper simulator.
Yep.
Interesting. Cool. Well, unfortunately, Matthew, it seems we're out of time for this episode of the Daily Dev Talk.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Great. Yeah, it was great. Great talking to you. A lot of stuff worth sharing and a lot of information, especially from people who work outside the industry. Oh, it was great to have experiences to draw upon, like marketing and PR in this case.
Thank you.
I wish you well. I wish you well on Project High Rise.
Thank you.
Stay tuned, Overload Nation. More Daily Dev Talk episodes to come. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Daily Dev Talk with me, Adrian Nantchev. If you are a game developer that wants to get your name and game out there and to share your experiences and stories, or you have feedback or opinions of the show, then contact me at info@gameoverload.co.uk. That's info@gameoverload.co.uk. Stay tuned for tomorrow's episode. More to come.